This is a short story called The Swamp and the Moon, written by a pseudonym, Mr. Gloom. Read by Mia. Edited by AKS. 1. Swamp Fog. I well remember a story father relayed to me when I was but a mere boy. He often held his lengthy monologues in front of the sole window of our small cabin, gazing outside into the grand marsh whose close outskirts our home was built onto. He'd tell these tales with glaze in his eyes, reminiscing times long past, oftentimes forgetting his surroundings altogether if I were to remain silent and just sit by the fire as the evening progressed into an ever-thickening fog. Such was the case, as well, during one particular autumn evening when the chill winds had just started their journeys from the north, from the swamp. The common folk hold no place for us. He started, his back to me, staring into the swamp fog outside. The towns are rotten, you see. They have degenerated into dulling foolishness that permeate all of civil life. There's no place for people like us in there, us authentic people. That word, authentic, was unfamiliar for my 8-year-old mind, so I inquired about it from the floor beside the fireplace. Yes, people like us, those who can see things. We can see things, you and me. It comes down in generations, via what's called genetics. Yet another word I was unfamiliar with, but this time I held my silence. The exact mechanism is of no matter, though. He briefly waved his hand. What matters is the factuality of it, that it separates us from the folk of town, the inauthentic people, those who remain in the unknown about the swamp fog. I wanted to form a question about the swamp, as it had been such a strong force in our lives, albeit always lingering in the background. He answered before I had the time to loud my thoughts. My father, your grandfather, you see, had his house in the swamp. Yes, his house was somewhere in there, in the great fog, although I never lived in it. Only saw it once when I was about your age, when we, me and him, ventured out there. He'd muse to me during the journey, utter out between breaths things like, such a miserable, God-forsaken place. And then, who in the world would make their home into a place like this? As we neared our destination, he suddenly turned to face me, as we stood knee-deep in mud where the once firm wooden planks had failed under the passage of time. There was a distinct pause, I noticed, as father stood unmoving, staring into the fog. I added more wood into the fire, and it answered with a shower of warm, pleasant sparks. Finally, he continued. When I looked up into his eyes, he answered himself with a weary face, one full of regret and resignation. It is not us, son, but the will to authenticity that makes us do these things. It is the curse of our line. You can choose to not listen to it, but sooner or later, it will get you. Oh yes, it will get you. But come on now, the place is not far anymore. Then he turned and continued wading through the mud, and I had to make haste lest I lose him into the mist. Wind pressed against the window back in our shack, gently at first, before picking up speed. It was the first sign of the grand northern gale that would travel over our lands every year. Late autumn changes of the air, as father called it. I never got used to it, how the wind blew for days at a time, carrying alien whispers into my ears, as it whistled through the gaps of our slowly swaying home. Your grandfather was a bit curious in that sense. I never could quite decipher what he was onto with his wise-sounding words. Perhaps a bit akin how I'm talking to you now, and you're thinking the same. No matter. It will make sense in time. I hope. The wind pushed the window and rattled loose boards. Through the window I saw glimpses of fog from the swamp circling the house. It wasn't that thick yet, I felt, but growing denser as more and more closed in, carried forth by the wind. Father swayed with the wind unconsciously as he continued. In any case, eventually we made it to the site of his old house. It was little more than a ruin back then, and I'm sure it's completely degenerated by now. There was a small hill, or rather an oddly shaped bloat in the risen ground, that yielded just enough soil for someone to make a construction of sorts. Not that anyone besides my father would be foolish enough to make such an attempt. Yet, as he said, he had livened most of his years in that small wooden shack, and only moved out when the wind had proven too much for his bones, as he put it. Once more I heard Father smile with melancholy as he added, "Yes, quite similarly as to how I built our house here at the outskirts. I tried living in the town for some time, but found it impossible. There's just too much foulness in the air, too much inauthenticity that people excrete as they pass by on the streets, the daily mundanity and pettiness of it all. How I loathed it. But where was I? There was that word again that I had not yet quite grasped, but it was of no use inquiring about it again, I sensed, and so I stayed silent, content for the moment, warmed by the fire. Father's words continued, haunting my ears. It was a disheartening, desolate sight, that shack deep in the swamp, but also somehow reassuring, like a memento of the fact that life had persisted even in that inhospitable land, that someone had had the perseverance to not just visit, but to live there. I couldn't help but revere the man. He sighed as he finally turned to me from the window, gaunt face aghast from all the memories. And that's the kind of man your grandfather was, adamant to the end, until the wind proved too much for his bones. I looked at his wizened face, memory-strained eyes, and asked, "But what happened next? What happened to Grandpa?" He took seat next to me on the floor and smiled at the fire. "In the end, the wind took him, son. The wind took him." 2. The Swamp and Us. There was a lull in the moment as he came to sit beside me and stare into the fire. I had gotten used to his monologues about the rotten state of society, or how the swamp was always there, waiting for us, or how the crows tended to circle too close our home. But now there was something different about him, as if he was in a hurry to reveal the most crucial aspects of his memories to me, that somehow he sensed this nebulous curse was growing nearer and nearer every moment, and he feared some calamity might befall us, unexpectedly, as this particular autumn evening pressed on. Nevertheless, of being unable to rationalize this fact into my childhood mind, I sensed it, and thus wanted to make most of my time. So I asked, "Dad, what is the swamp?" This simple and, on the surface, foolish-seeming question paused him, and for the longest while he remained silent. Later in life I understood that it wasn't that he didn't want to answer, but that he lacked a comprehensive answer himself. Or rather understood it at some level, but lacked the rationale to put it into words, similar to my 8-year-old mind. Such an imbalance of years, yet we both were equally children when it came to this topic. It is the curse of our line, we are drawn to it, I now have seen. We cannot exist anywhere else, yet this place is the doom of us all. He looked at me and smiled with the weariness of a man who'd walked 1,000 spiritual miles. "I do not wish to scare you, but it's time you hear of these things, being as old as you are now." Sensing my confusion, he continued, "By me telling you of these things, I hope you'll be more ready than I was, or, as I suspect, even your grandfather was, despite all his strength." Then he resumed his stare into the waning fire. The small logs that I had added were well burned by now, reduced to a pile of charcoal. I thought of adding more, but as I looked at my father's tired eyes, something halted my hand. Soon after, he got up with a grunt and said, "I must head out now to face the fog. You stay in, near the fire, as always. Don't worry, I'll be fine." But he wasn't fine. This time he vanished into the fog, stolen by the wind. 3. How it steals from us. I do not remember how much time passed before I headed out in search of him. It might have been minutes, it might have been hours. All I knew that I was running out of firewood, and I didn't want to be left alone in the dark. Thus I got up, got the spare lantern from the shelf, and stepped through the door. Outside I sensed the moon shine through the fog, but its light struggled to reach me, as everything around our small home was swirling in a dense, foul-smelling swamp fog. Breathing in and lifting my lantern, I adjusted my thick woolen coat, that was quite oversized for me, it being Father's old one, then took a step forward and listened. In the distance, cicadas chirped their nightly songs, and wind whistled softly around me, but other than that, it was dead quiet. Behind me, beyond the poorly fitted wooden walls, the fireplace continued cracking and sending out its last sparks up the uneven chimney. Already I longed for its warmth, but I had made the decision. I was out, and so I did my best to calm myself, trying not to think of the fog and all the hideous horrors hiding in it. After a few dreadful seconds I yelled, or wanted to yell, but out came a whimper. "Dad? Dad?" There was no answer. I turned and took a few steps towards the firewood shack, a small sheet metal building not far from our house. Even in the fog I well knew the way, and so, wading through the swaying grass that refused to stay down despite being repeatedly pressed down, I soon made it to my destination. A vague outline of a building appeared from the haze. I opened the rusted door and peered in. Nothing but neatly assembled rows of spruce and pine, just as I remembered having stacked them a few days prior. In all honesty, I doubted he'd be there. For what reason would he have to be hiding in the firewood shack? But it was the only secure place I could think of I could search, and while I was there I thought I might as well take a scream from the swamp. It was Father, full of terror. I am not proud of myself, of what I did that day, but after all I was but a mere boy, 8 years of age. I ran back to the house and latched the door, spending the night quivering beside the slowly dying fire. 4. Perhaps there's some solace in life still. In the morn the mists had cleared a little, but the wind remained. Memories after that point have become hazy, but I must have walked into the town in search for help, as I recall sitting in some waiting area of a grand hall with a cup of hot tea, hiding under a blanket some generous soul had gifted to me. It could have been Mr. Wiziak, for from that point on he acted as my mentor and caregiver of sorts. It is a lengthy story as to how I became his apprentice at the herbalist shop afterwards, and not that pertinent to this story. Nevertheless, I ended up staying in town after that night, under the care of good Mr. Wiziak, the town's remedy man, as the townsfolk called him. Perhaps it is a bit redundant to mention here that my father was never found. A haphazard search was conducted by the town's authorities, but I sensed no one had much willingness to venture into the swamp. They did their best, the town constable told me, but apparently there was no trace of him anywhere to be found. Not in the woods, nor in the swamp, although, as said, from his uncertain tone, I got the impression that they'd spend much more time in the woods than in the swamp, perhaps contented altogether in simply shouting my father's name from the outskirts, similar as to what I had attempted doing on that dreadful night. I hold no grudge against them, however, as I'm sure they did what they could. From that point on, I became a trainee of Mr. Wiziak. I still recall him fondly, for he was and remains the sole person I ever developed any kind of mutually respectful relationship in the town. Although I must say he was quite difficult at first. He was a stoutly God-fearing fellow who attempted instilling his theories on me from the very beginning. Not 2 days had passed when he began telling me about how I must forget my old life, about having ever lived near the swamp, that he thought as the devil's playground, and that from this point on I must learn to fear the Lord as he had his whole life. Now, even as young as I was, I realized that his way of seeing the world, his truth, so to say, was just as valid for him as my father's truth about genetics and the curse of the swamp had been. In other words, Mr. Wiziak's code was that of God, when my father's had been that of the swamp. I saw them as equals in a sense, but being respectful for my new mentor, I diligently listened to his numerous lectures about the metaphysics of the divine and applied objective morality of the Almighty, raising no questions nor even yielding doubtful glances at his direction. I did, however, try to question him about the swamp a few times to see if he knew more about it, being a learned man after all, but such attempts were always quickly shut down from his part. The most he was willing to tell me was that my whole family line had been dubious, and never quite fitting in with the normal Lord-fearing folk. This much coincided with my father's views, but still, I always retained the lingering sense that there was more than he was ready to reveal, perhaps in fears of feeding the latent curse that was lurking just beyond the corner of my genetics, ready to spring into fruition at the earliest opportunity. He was right, though, in a sense, for already in my pre-adolescent years, a few years after the swamp incident, I began hearing curious whispers late at night when sleeping in the attic of Mr. Wiziak's herbal store. Coal smog of the town, no doubt mixed with swamp fog, would slither in through the cracks in the window, bringing me back into that horrendous night, and with those memories came back the alien whispers of the wind that always seemed to find a way in, not only into my shelter, but into my mind, calling out my name in an attempt of making me go back to the swamp and finding the truth of it all. The truth of what? I did not know at the time, but the call was very real, and only amplified as the months passed by, ultimating in a singular late autumn night, one that marked the 7th anniversary of the swamp incident. I was laying awake in my bed, repeatedly turning in a vain search for sleep that night, thoughts of the swamp circling in my mind, as tended to be the case. That horrific scream of my father repeated in my ears, an unnatural sound of no equal, still fresh in my mind after all those years. What had he encountered in the swamp? What force could be so strong that seemingly none of my lineage had possessed the tenacity to withstand it? And most importantly, what made me think I would be the sole person in this long genetic line to push against these forces? I did not know, but I knew I couldn't resist it any longer, and so I tossed the covers out of the way and got up, then stepped before the small attic window. I saw below the city sleep, occasional lights in the windows shining through dense coal smog. Most of the residents seemed to have retreated for the night, tenants fast asleep after the day's long toil. The rooftops, however, were oddly shining that night, reflecting a definite silver line. I traced this light upwards above the distant tree line to the sky, where I saw it, the perfect full moon, beaming unobstructed by a singular cloud. That mysterious silver ball felt brighter, that night, as I stood thoughtless before the small attic window. Deep in my mind I knew it was acting as a compass of a kind, showing the path to the swamp. I must have been hypnotized by its presence, for the next thing I knew I had my coat on, and was traversing the silent streets, guided by moonlight, onwards, towards the swamp. It didn't take long for me to be out of town, into the woods, walking the overgrown path towards my old home. It was cold, but I cared not, for I was guided by forces unknown. The forest rested around me, in equal measure to the town. There was nothing in the world in mind for me, but the swamp and the moon. Thus I made my way, walking a steady pace, until I was at the threshold where the forest and the swamp met, and there, as the trees cleared, pines and bushes giving way to a silver-fogged clearing, I saw my home, or the ruins of it. I wrapped myself deeper into the long coat and walked towards the charred ruins. What once had been a safe haven in my youth was now but a memory of it. From the charcoal rubble, a grey, faded chimney still stood, holding fast against the decay of time. I circled the area, feet wading in swaying grass, until I saw the firewood shack. It was still standing, seemingly pristine, just as the day I had taken shelter in it. Hesitantly, I approached the sheet metal door to pull it open. It let out a familiar, jarring sound, but did not resist. The insides were pitch black at first, but the moon's light from directly behind me lit the small closet-like area into a spectacle of refracted hues as the swamp fog slithered in, along with my feet. I was inside, and for a moment I felt like I had never left that night, but stayed amidst the piles of neatly piled firewood surrounding, shielding me. I spun around a few times, unsure what I was doing there, then shook my head, for there was no going back in life, only forward. And so I said my goodbyes to the old firewood shack and stepped out, back into the moon's cold light. And then I faced the swamp. It's hard to say whether I consciously made the steps or not, but there I was, standing at the edge, the wet pools of mud infesting the landscape ahead. I traced my eyes horizontally, peering into the swirling fog, feeling the slight gusts of wind, waiting, expecting, not sure what. Perhaps voices, perhaps apparitions of some kind to come greet me. Above, the moon shone its rays, piercing the fog and sending refracting spark-like phenomena dancing erratically in the air. There was something in there, I was sure, this night, something that I needed to see. But for the moment my feet refused to move, and I was stuck, standing in place. I stood still, holding Father's long woolen coat tight around my body. Then in the distance, I saw the swirling fog clear a little, making way to Moon's beams, and indeed amongst the few struggling spruces there I saw forms, twisted bodies with multiple branches or arms reaching from the ground, contorting towards the sky. They had head-like protrusions with expressions suggesting great pain and struggle, and in body they were like trees, unmoving, yet still somehow alive. Most of them held hair-like foliage hanging from their heads, some shorter, shoulder-length, some as long to reach the ground. The longer-haired ones seemed fairer in their form, more feminine, graceful, although equally pained and tormented as their supposedly male counterparts. In an instant the fog shifted again and the forms were again in veil. I shook my head and looked up, realizing suddenly that it was not the swamp the things had been reaching for. It was the moon. The swamp was just a birthplace to emerge from, to struggle upwards towards something greater. I gasped as I stared at the moon, which seemed now somehow larger, closer, as if hanging just above the swamp fog. I felt like being at the cusp of understanding something grandiose. But just then I heard a voice shout from behind. "What in the Lord's name are you doing out here, boy?" It was Mr. Wisiak. It was time to go back. 5. The Curse of Our Line. Early next morning, at the usual lecture hour before we'd opened shop, I expected harsh reprimanding from the old man. He paced around for quite a while, deep in thought, before his teaching lectern, while I sat still at the centre of the classroom at my small school desk. The night prior he'd not said a word as we walked back, and I had dared not ask anything. Now I only waited for whatever punishment he'd deemed suitable for me. But that was not to come, I realized, as he finally stopped before his lectern, leaning against it, head down. "I knew it would come to this, I just knew it," he began musing. "The curse has manifested, despite my efforts." He raised his head. "Tell me, what did you see in there, in the swamp?" I was taken aback a little, but gathered myself. "No, nothing really, just some trees." He suddenly slammed his fist onto the lectern. "Damn it, don't toy with me, boy. Now tell me, what did you see?" I knew better to play not around this time. "I saw forms, some strange beings in the swamp. They were struggling upwards, towards—" For some reason I couldn't finish the sentence, but he knew what I meant. "The moon." He said the word with a strange reverence in his eyes, one I had not witnessed before. I stammered, "What is it, Mr. Wisiak? What are the moon and the swamp, please? I must not—" He sighed loud enough for me to stop my sentence. Then he started pacing around again, brow furrowed, hands behind his arched back. "Do you remember from my lectures how there's always a certain percentage of any given population especially attuned for receiving divine phenomena?" I nodded. "It is quite apparent that the curse of your lineage makes you one of these individuals. Now this attunement seems like a blessing for receiving the word of the Lord, which it is, of course. But it also works both ways. It makes one attuned for other kinds of things as well, something beyond the divine." He drew breath, now looking at me. "The swamp and the moon are such forces, they work in unison. I suppose you also remember how I've always reminded you to walk humbled before the Lord, to keep your head bowed, respectful?" I nodded again. "There's a reason for it," he suddenly shouted. "One must remember to not gaze at the divine for too long. It is not our place to go scrounging the depths of the Lord's machinations, for it only brings ruination for the soul. As for the moon, it is up there alluring, demonic, tempting to be gazed at. The sun burns the eyes and the moon burns the soul. Do you understand?" I couldn't recall any such sermon from him, but fearing of disrupting his train of thought, I stayed silent, only nodding in agreement. He took hold of his lectern with both hands, staring at me as he revelled in his delivery. The moon is the devil's temptation for the intellect. He tempts us to look at it, and while gazing up we forget where our feet lead us, straight into the swamp, where we'll drown, become puppets for forces we have no understanding of. That's why you keep your head down, boy, and should relinquish such aspirations of investigating things that are beyond your mortal grasp. He breathed deep, still staring at me. While I understood certain reasoning within his furious venting, I wasn't quite sure of its logical coherency. Mustering the little strength of will I had, I argued instinctively. So you say to not try understanding the Lord's mind? He gave a slight nod. Yet the material dominion is part of Lord's will, is it not? I noticed how he shifted balance, sensing an uncomfortable argument approaching. I pressed on. But is it not your alchemical exploration of herbal remedies just like this, using one's intellect in order to discern the way of the world, the will of the Lord, to produce something that is not part of his original design? He leaned back, just a little, and a mixture of emotions visited his face. But those eyes of a fanatical believer did not stray from mine even for a second. He remained such for what seemed like minutes, but what was most likely just a moment. Then he suddenly laughed, saying, "So you have listened to something I've said after all?" In an instant his whole body eased, and he waved his hand. "We shall discuss this some other time. It's almost time to open shop. Come on." He motioned for me to follow as he walked to the door. Puzzled of the sudden turn of events, I simply stayed silent, got up, and followed in his lead. 6. Metaphysics of the Divine. The day passed relatively uneventfully, and I expected him to continue his lecturing about the swamp and the moon later that afternoon, in the evening class. However, it seemed as if he'd forgotten about the topic altogether by that point, as he did only a brief lecture about the applied objective morality of the divine, one which I had heard before, if only in a slightly different form. The next day was the same, and I experienced little deviation from the norm. Only thing I noticed was that my attic door had now a deadbolt on at the other side, and Mr. Wisiak made sure to latch it tight every night. For my own safety, he said, just so that my little excursion was not to repeat. Thus proceeded my life for a few months, the boring lectures continuing in an unseeming fashion, while during day I helped him with the herbal store. Occasionally I attempted probing about the topic of the moon and the swamp via roundabout ways, but it appeared as if he'd resumed his old reserved self, and seemed almost a bit embarrassed about his earlier vigorous outburst. As time passed, however, I began to sense a peculiar restlessness about him, especially about his lectures about the metaphysics of the divine, as if he wasn't as sure about his theorems any longer. Perhaps he feared further questioning from me. Perhaps his own lack of faith had shaken him, I cannot say for sure. But a definite alteration within his behavior was starting to manifest, that much was certain. Then, at the onset of spring after a particularly harsh winter, while he was lecturing about the applied objective morality of the divine again, for the 10th or so time, I finally grew tired of his facades, and decided to challenge him again now, in a more mentally prepared state since last autumn. I was sitting at my overly familiar desk at the center of the small classroom, waiting for a suitable opportunity to veer the dialogue into the desired direction, while Mr. Wisiak paced behind his lectern in his usual manner. He was at one point going through a well-rehearsed theorem once more, when I noticed a small discrepancy within his words. His voice, stout but tired, went as follows. And so, when you look at the Lord's words in this manner, it becomes unquestionably clear what is meant in his text. Indeed, one cannot find his way in life in any other way than through him, that is, as I've stated before, via realizing one's potential in his eyes. He emanates knowledge, and it's up to us to interpret it in a correct manner, not for us to go seek our own contextualization of it from our own lives, or our own preconceived notions about what morality or wisdom should be. In other words, the emanation of his light is the light itself, and we need only follow it in order to reach our true potential, our true fate. I raised my hand briefly, and he nodded his approval for me to ask a question. "And this light is the sun, right?" He nodded again. "And the moon is the false prophet of alluring intellect." He twitched a little upon hearing of this notion again. I continued, "The moon reflects the sun's light, is that not true?" He could barely hold his anger. "Are you toying with me again, boy?" "No, I'm merely asking a question, referring to your alchemical lectures concerning the relationship between the material and the divine, as above so below, as indeed the well-known law dictates. Thus, it would follow that the moon's qualities are merely reflective of the Lord's will, and not directly opposed to it in any malicious manner." He leaned forward, taking hold of the lectern with both hands, not too dissimilarly as when I had last dared questioning him. This time, though, he had no words, and I pressed on, bolstered by his doubt. "If all is Lord's dominion, and his ways are necessarily, in technical terms, benevolent, then this, my curse, would be of his will, and it would mean that entering the swamp in lure of the moon is what he wishes of me." A deep silence followed, and I felt my heart beating in the chest. I had unconsciously leaned forward like Mr. Wiziak, pressing my hands against the desk. We stared at each other as I waited for his words. Sand in Mr. Wiziak's hourglass flowed and flowed, yet no word escaped his mouth. Finally he eased and sat down, sighing. "I see I cannot delay the inevitable any longer. I have no argument against you. The swamp and the moon have allured you too deep, and you're almost at the age of manhood. I cannot shelter you much longer, and I fear you shall suffer your father's fate soon enough." In an instant I felt furious again, for no apparent reason. "It is not your place to shelter me into perpetuity. I'm grateful for your hospitality, of course. You have been a blessing." I winced upon using religious vocabulary unconsciously. "You have been a wise mentor. But I have seen that—" He smiled suddenly as he looked upon me, interrupting. "I have seen for some time that you aren't really interested in my speculations anymore. Oftentimes I find you glancing at the window, especially during dark winter days, when the late evening lectures are almost at the end and the full moon is rising on the horizon. I know now that you're almost a man by this point, and so let us speak like such, man to man. So tell me, what do you really think?" It was my turn to be at loss for words. He continued, "I sense that most of the time during my lectures you aren't paying much attention, except to formulate your own theorems and arguments, such that you could tempt our discussion to what you are really after, which would be the swamp and the moon, as we both well knew by now." He concluded, making a sweeping motion. "You don't truly believe in the Lord, do you? And neither do you believe the moon to be a part of Lord's will. So tell me, what do you really think?" He repeated and leaned back, crossing his arms. I exhaled and leaned back as well. I had expected some kind of result from this evening lecture, but not to this extent, and now I was put to the spot, suddenly forced to formulate my theory without prior preparation. This was the moment, and so I began with a small concession. "I don't think your theories of the Lord are entirely without merit. Without doubt, this belief of the divine force would have not survived such a long time without it containing certain truths about the human condition, and perhaps even metaphysical nature of the world. However, whereas you have inherited this knowledge from sacred books and religious scholars, taking the word for granted, I have not inherited anything, well, except maybe from my lineage." Mr. Wiziak smiled with compassion, something that was quite unusual for him. "Your cursed lineage." I stared at the blackboard behind him and continued my recital, as if from some ancestral memory. "Yes, indeed, but this curse, I believe, seems merely as such if viewed from a certain perspective. You yourself have made the notion about certain individuals being of especial susceptibility to the unknown forces. Well, I have postulated that, with the aid of this seemingly attuned nature, along with strength of will and understanding of mental currents, as well as theorems of the divine, thanks to you, I might be able to withstand the swamp and truly gaze at the moon, look at it long enough to understand the truth of it all, whatever it may end up being, whatever the moon will end up revealing, once I have made the pilgrimage through the swamp, through the trials. Mr. Wisiak was quiet for a moment as he looked down and scratched his grey beard. Then he lifted his head and asked, "You say the moon is not of the Lord, but if it isn't of the devil either, what is it of then?" I focused my eyes into his and said, "She is Sophia, and she is the way." 7. Sophia. We did not speak much after my words about Sophia. Either Mr. Wisiak was left speechless before my shining intellect, which was quite unlikely, or he simply had no way of responding to such an unfamiliar concept. Either way, we concluded the evening class with little ceremony and retreated to our respective quarters. The next day, however, at the morning lecture before opening shop, I made the request that I remain as his student and apprentice for the following summer, but at the onset of autumn would be deemed a free man, free to pursue whatever forces I wished thereafter. Having acknowledged my position being at the threshold of adulthood, Mr. Wisiak agreed, but wished that I attend all the lectures planned for summer, and do all the work concerning the herbal shop without complaint. These terms sounding reasonable, I agreed, and thus began my plans about excursion into the swamp. My freedom was still a few months away, the summer only beginning at that point, but time would go fast, as I'd experienced in the past, and thus all kinds of mental and physical preparation had to be started without delay. First order of business was to go to the local library and search for that strange name I'd uttered unexpectedly even to myself, Sophia. I knew not what kind of force was behind such a name, and I knew even less what had prompted me to declare it with such certainty that evening. I knew, however, that this divine something was certainly behind the mystical allure of the moon. All I had to go by at that point was a mere name, but that name alone, especially when uttered out aloud, produced feelings and aspirations, forces of such sublime nature in my soul that I could not deny its veracity. Thus, in the following weeks, I thoroughly scrounged the local library, which was small but surprisingly well stocked. Yet the search yielded little of value. Only in a few scholarly scrolls that had mentions about a forgotten practice called Gnosticism, I glimpsed mentions of her. But as the text quite plainly pointed out, such practices had long since died out, and by now mere fragmented mentions of its existence remained. Remembering that I was soon to be a free man, though, I queried Mr. Wisiak about it one night, after a mildly interesting lecture concerning man's inheritance of free will via the Lord. Even if he knew nothing of Sophia, perhaps he knew something of Gnosticism, a practice that had, in the past, been adjacent to the branch of religion he now preached. And so I made my question when we were about to retreat for the night, sitting beside a small fireplace of his quaint resting room, at the back of the storage area of his herbal shop. "Mr. Wisiak, do you know anything of something called Gnosticism?" This question produced no result in his facial expression at first, as he stared into the fire, weary after the day's toil. Slowly his awareness returned to my question, though, and he begun. "Interesting that you should mention it. I was thinking of your mention of that name. What was it?" He adjusted the flaming logs in the fire with his iron poker. "Sophia, yes." His tired eyes traced the dancing flames, and now for the first time I noticed he was getting old. It was a strange, harrowing realization. I suddenly thought how my father never saw his own old age. Back when I was a boy, about your age, I studied under esteemed theologians, back in the city. Seeing my expression, he laughed. In a real city boy, much larger than this small town. In any case, there was one aged emeritus who had retired from the profession a long time ago, but still visited the campus area occasionally, out of habit, I assume, to entertain young students at their breaks, giving informal lectures at the local park. He smiled at the memory, and I could vision Mr. Wisiak, this now wizened old man, in his prime youth, sitting on marble stones surrounded by his enthusiastic peers, listening to an aged professor giving a fascinating lecture about metaphysical matters. He continued, "This professor, he had been one of the last remaining practitioners of Gnosticism. I knew little of it at the time, only getting the gist that it had been shunned in years past, increasingly growing out of favour, until banned altogether from church life. I do not know the reasons for it, but the professor mentioned, I think, that for reasons I fail to remember now, that he alone had been allowed to continue teaching this ancient knowledge. He smiled as he looked at me, with the caveat of always declaring it as obsolete falsehood, of course. He fell silent for a moment, and continued absent-mindedly poking the slowly dancing flames. I kept thinking of his days as a student, and suddenly I envied him immensely. What a life he must have led, learning forbidden secrets in a grand historical city, surrounded by peers and intellectuals, something I'd never had the luxury of experiencing. But these thoughts were vain, I quickly realized, and they vanished as fast as they had appeared, when the old man continued. I listened to him sometimes in that park. His speech was such an archaic dialect, and subjects so esoteric, that it often went over our heads. These lectures being quite informal as they were, he had little consideration for the standard practice of easing clueless students into difficult topics. In any case, he occasionally spoke of various traditions, and how he had been part of strange cults and so forth. I'm sure none of this interests you that much, but I think he one time talked about old gods or goddesses of this Gnostic hierarchy, and somewhere amongst them might have been the name Sophia. Hearing the name again in Mr. Wiziak's hoarse tone sent a sudden chill throughout my body. I don't recall what she represented, what kind of deity she was in that system. She might have been the Lord's Queen, although, as said, such notions are falsehood in the orthodox view, and in my opinion as well. But nevertheless, it wasn't as if she was in a lower or equal position with the Lord. It was something different. It was... but my memory fails me. He sighed as he ran his hand through greying hair, and then put the poker down. Alas, I cannot say much more about it. I stared into the fire, feeling ambivalent, for I had gained some information regarding this elusive figure, yet at the same time it felt woefully insufficient. Nevertheless, I now had confirmation that my unconscious utterance wasn't mere imagination, that prior knowledge of it existed, and was documented, coded into a practice, even if so closeted and esoteric. I turned to look at Mr. Wiziak and asked, but she was part of Lord's dominion, and not opposed to it. Mr. Wiziak smiled and answered just as I'd expected. All is Lord's dominion, boy, none shall escape it. Sensing my follow-up question, he added, no, not even the devil. After those words, I concluded that Mr. Wiziak's beliefs would be of little use to me from this point on, and that I'd be alone in my search. Both my father's views and those of Mr. Wiziak's were parts of a greater truth, I sensed, something that I could perhaps piece together and make a greater hypothesis, perhaps even forming the truth of it all, just as I'd heard the moon or Sophia allude in a whisper during that strange night of my dreamlike swamp excursion. Seeing how Mr. Wiziak was by now almost falling asleep beside the fire, I softly wished him good night, and without making a sound, retreated into my small attic room. There I spent many restless hours turning in bed, occupied in a vain search for sleep, febrile visions of the moon dancing in front of my closed eyes. 8. The Moon Beyond the Swamp. After having concluded that Mr. Wiziak would be of no further use to me, I was left adrift. There was still some considerable mental preparation to do before I could venture into the swamp, I sensed, and thus felt anxious the following weeks, searching for ways to get further information of the elusive figure of Sophia. If neither my father's words concerning my lineage, a sort of pagan way of seeing things, nor Mr. Wiziak's teachings of the divine, the orthodox religious stance, were of any use, what venues there were left for me, I knew not, but was determined to look into the only remaining place I had not yet examined fully, namely that of my own mind. Thus, as the autumn started nearing, and I was still restlessly pondering on these questions, I took it upon myself to listen to my own self. That is, to document my thoughts on paper, usually late at evening before going to bed, a time wherein thoughts flowed most free, a time wherein I could perhaps attain visions of the figure that had been influencing my thoughts and aspirations so vividly. Alas, the words did not come easy, as I was to find out. Numerous nights I sat beside the lone desk of my attic room before the small window, overseeing the city towards the swamp. I attempted reiterating my thoughts and feelings concerning this subject, but every time I ended up faced with the impassable wall, that immeasurably vast gulf between the subjective and the objective, that is, in other words, man's limited capacity to comprehend the other side, whatever that in actuality was. I knew, nevertheless, that on this other side there resided Sophia, and it was the place where my answers would lie. And so I tirelessly sat before that small attic window, staring at the evening sky towards the swamp, quill in hand, waiting for the words that felt so slow in coming. So proceeded the following weeks of late summer, and as the month turned August and I still had not a single coherent word on paper, I forsook this forceful approach, and instead thought simply documenting my own journey thus far, and so this very journal was born. Even if I could not write directly about Sophia, perhaps simply telling of my tale, if only for myself, would arouse feelings and thoughts hitherto unknown, and so, after a brief period of hesitation, I began, and to my surprise the words flowed rather freely after getting over the initial mental inertia. I started this manuscript with haste, writing of my early days with father, his disappearance, and the curse of our lineage. As I wrote the words concerning the curse, I began to experience strange tics at the left side of my head, perhaps physical symptoms signaling that I was on the right trajectory. Bolstered by this strange sign, I continued well over midnight, until fatigue forced the quill out of my hand. Now I shall carefully lay these pages into the desk's drawer and retire to bed. But for the first time in weeks, I feel like I can perhaps sleep soundly, without a singular distressing dream. I found my dear friend vanished this morning. Let us pray that he will find his moon beyond the swamp in the Lord's grace. I did what I could. Joseph Wysiak.